For our listeners, I'd first love for you to define what is product-led content, or maybe more specifically, what is product-led content in the context of one of the B2B companies you work with.
Product-led content ties the product you're selling to a content narrative that isn't obviously about your product to begin with, right? It has your product tactfully woven into it. So it's one way to make a brand impression without resorting to those aggressive sales pitches, which, are only appropriate in very specific situations. So for instance, you could use your product or some real world application of your product to illustrate a point. You could present it as a solution or one approach to solving a problem or addressing a challenge, while also weighing other solutions and possible approaches to solving that challenge. You could feature one of your customers as a hero and mention your product, but in an auxiliary way, as a background character that represents some sort of tool they use to help them achieve something or do something, which is different in a case study in that sense. Those are just a few examples, but I think the secret to creating the best product-led content is to think like a journalist.
Hi, and welcome to the Optimize podcast. My name is Nate Matherson, and I am your host. On this weekly podcast, we sit down with some of the smartest minds in content marketing and SEO. Our goal is to give you perspective and insights on what's moving the needle in organic search. Today, I'm thrilled to sit down with Caitlin Hartney. Caitlin is the director of strategy at Block Club, an agency that works primarily with B2B tech companies on brand and content strategy. On this week's episode, Caitlin and I chat about product-led content, B2B content strategy, and even the most recent Google leak, which I know everyone is talking about, but we're going to talk about it too. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Optimize podcast. It's brought to you by Positional. If you don't know by now, my name's Nate, and I'm one of the co-founders of Positional, and we've built what I think is a pretty awesome tool set for content marketing and SEO teams. We've got tools for keyword research, internal linking, content optimization, and even a couple tools for analytics. We'd love for you to check it out at positional.com. Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on this week's episode of the Optimize podcast.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So the first question I ask all of our guests is, how did you get into the world of content marketing and SEO?
I would say that I started in content marketing 15 years ago, I guess it is at this point. I was working with an AMLA 250 corporate law firm at the time in communications. So back then, and that's probably still true for them today, is ranking for terms like best law firm was irrelevant. It's just not how their target customers shop for legal services. It's really reputational based and referral based. But what did matter was out-experting the competition, if that's a word. I may have just made it up, and building the reputations of their partners. So at the time, my content marketing efforts were pretty squarely focused on thought leadership and LinkedIn marketing. Eventually, I worked my way to Block Club, first as a senior copywriter, and now for the past, 3 years as director of strategy. So my portfolio in that time has really grown, expanded to include brands like Plaid and Argyle, Kodat, and Culture Amp. So I've been very fortunate to be able to work with them and for them. I also have a light background in editorial. I would not call myself a journalist by any means. But before I became a mother and started leading a growing company, I actually had time to do things. And I used some of that time to write on a freelance basis for local and regional publications in my hometown. And I think bringing a journalism mindset to content has been invaluable for me personally.
Absolutely. I find myself saying all of the time, we need to think like journalists, or at least some of the time. But yes, well, you have such an interesting background, and I'm excited to chat with you today and have this conversation. And you and I chatted a little offline before the recording about product-led content, also developing content strategies for B2B companies. And I know you have experience working with well, they're household names to me, companies like Coda and Plaid. And I'm excited to unpack some of those learnings here today. But before we get into product-led content, I have to ask, just because it is so timely, do you have any thoughts on the recent Google leak? And just for our listeners who don't already know, there was like a massive document that was leaked by a member of Google's search team, which included a whole lot of information about how Google's algorithm works and the inputs to it. But back to the question, do you have any thoughts on the recent algorithm leak that's been kind of breaking the internet, and at least in SEO world?
I think what stands out most for me is there's just still more questions than there are answers about how the algorithm works. So I don't necessarily see this as like any kind of Rosetta Stone that's cracking everything open for us. But of the takes that I have seen, two stuck with me. And one, because it raises a question for me that maybe you even have an answer to. I don't know. We'll see. And one, because it rings true for me. So what rings true for me is this idea that at the end of the day, building a strong, well-recognized brand is still most important. I think the rationale behind the take that I read is that, Google seems to favor sending traffic to powerful brands. And whether that's the result of some Google agenda that I'm not aware of or a byproduct of its algorithm, I couldn't say, I guess, but I think it's true that people will be more likely to click on content from a brand they recognize, and click behavior informs ranking, which clearly does to at least some extent, then that will obviously favor well-known brands. But I think, SEO people out there are also well aware that there's anecdotal evidence that content from even relatively small, unknown brands can rank well and quickly too. So aside from even that potentially contentious claim that having an authoritative brand is essential and not having one will hurt you in SEO, putting brand before SEO is just always good advice, because none of it, like the rankings or the traffic, will mean anything if you're attracting the wrong visitors to your site, first and foremost, or communicating nothing or the wrong thing about who or what your brand is in the process. And I guess what I mean by that is not that everyone should be making a sales pitch in every single piece of content they create. That would be ridiculous. I mean, communicating subtler messages about the brand you're representing and leaving an intentional impression.
I think over the years, I would say, I don't want to put a date on it, but and from my view, it seemed like around like 2017, 2018, like brand signal started to get a lot more important. And I don't mean to put a date on it, but that's at least what I saw when, I was looking at the rankings for some of the keywords we were in at the time. But I know you have a second observation.
Yeah. And so I don't want to name names, but I saw that one thought leader suggested that EAT may not actually be as important as we thought. And I think this person called it likely to be 80% propaganda. But what strikes me about it is that it doesn't really align with my experience. Like, I think smart, well-researched, authoritative content performs well and better than content that is not those things. But I also think that, like, the idea of EAT being propaganda raises the question of, like, why would Google exaggerate the importance of EAT? Like, what's in it for them? No one creates propaganda without purpose. So propaganda is a tool leveraged for a specific end, generally to manipulate people. So maybe I'm naive, and why would what would their motive be, I guess, for exaggerating the importance of EAT? And I don't know if you have an opinion on that, but you may.
Yeah, I fall into the camp that, like, EAT does matter. I recently reread like the 170-page like search rater guidelines, and they talk about EAT over and over again, and like reiterate different parts of it. So, for example, like, a search rater might want to look up the reputation of an author or the reputation of a company. I think that, like, is EAT like a ranking factor? Probably not. But I think that by implementing EAT, I don't even like to say implementing EAT, but like by implementing EAT, I think we probably create for like a better experience for the people who ultimately do come to our pages. Like, whether that means like, having an author bio or having content that's written by experts or having a positive reputation generally for our business. Like I think, whether EE is a ranking factor, I think all of those other things probably impact or are ranking factors. And so I don't see EE as like a checkbox. I see it more as like we're going to do these things anyways because it's going to probably improve the quality of content and the experience people have on our site. And I think those things will impact our rankings in a positive way. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely controversial depending on who you talk to, but I guess I fall into the camp of do it because it'll probably help you convert more customers if you do than if you don't, regardless of how well those pages rank in search. But yeah, I think there's a lot to get through still in regards to this Google leak, but I totally agree with you that brand seems like an important factor. And, we've seen that with other guests that we've talked to, like who have, very large presences on TikTok or YouTube. And often like they've described to us that like, success on a platform like YouTube has directly positively impacted like all of the work they're doing on the other side of things. And so it's going to be interesting to see. And that's, why part of the reason we have this podcast, so we can talk about the things that don't matter, at least according to Google. But anyways, let's get into the meat of it. I know, you've got this phrase that we were chatting about, product-led content. And I know at Block Club, you work with a lot of B2B companies. And so for our listeners, I'd first love for you to like define like what is product-led content, or maybe more specifically, what is product-led content in the context of, one of the B2B companies you work with?
So product-led content ties the product you're selling to a content narrative that isn't obviously about your product to begin with, right? It has your product tactfully woven into it. So it's one way to make a brand impression without resorting to those aggressive sales pitches, which, are only appropriate in very specific situations. So for instance, you could use your product or some real world application of your product to illustrate a point. You could present it as a solution or one approach to solving a problem or addressing a challenge, while also weighing other solutions and possible approaches to solving that challenge. You could feature one of your customers as a hero and mention your product, but like in an auxiliary way, as a background character that represents some sort of like tool they use to help them achieve something or do something, which is different in a case study in that sense. Those are just a few examples, but I think the secret to creating the best product-led content is to think like a journalist, to go back to those earlier points. So if you think about it, and if anyone's ever kind of tried to pitch a journalist, you will find that they will not entertain a pitch about your product just for the sake of promoting your product. But a journalist might talk about your product in an article if it adds value or color to, say, like some human interest story or current event story that they're already writing. And frankly, those are the stories people want to read anyway. So if you take that mindset with your content, it means zooming out from the product you're selling to find the story or stories around it that your audience cares about and wants to consume, and then tactfully weaving your content throughout.
Yeah, and I talk to a lot of early stage B2B companies, and I'll read some of their pages, and I say to them like 2/3 of this is like a commercial for your product. Maybe only 1/3 of it is actually going into depth and to like the H1, like the topic that we're supposed to be writing about. And do you find that like startups typically want to lead more promotional to begin with, and you kind of have to like reel them back in to actually say like, no, we should just like offer value and be like a helpful resource first, and then figure out how we weave our company into the narrative?
That's a good question. I would say that, especially at the earliest stages, they need content that explains very explicitly like how their content works, right? Why they exist. And that's content that's more about them. But I think because product-led content so clearly has them in it. They're very open and welcoming to the idea in a way that they're more resistant to, jumping into that very top of funnel content that really doesn't mention them at all. Like, that's too much of a long game for a lot of the startups we're working with at the stage we're working at them with. And obviously startups, range have a range of stages that a startup can be in. So it depends. But those earliest stages, I would say that they're very open to product-led content in a way that they're not with like that casting that wide net with really, really top of funnel content.
So would it be fair to say that like product-led content falls to like the middle section of the funnel? It's not like the top of the funnel, like a what is article, but it's also not like, sales collateral at the bottom of the funnel. Is product-led content like the middle of the funnel in terms of like helping that potential buyer like solve a problem and also get aware of a product that might help them?
Yeah, obviously, like, you can define the stages of the funnel. There's some like gray area where one becomes the other, at least in my experience. That happens. And I would say that product-led content generally falls like bottom of the top of the funnel through the middle of the funnel. Thinking, for example, of like, something I've written recently for a client, and it was talking about like this inflection point that the lending industry is in with regard to alternative data and the data revolution and using data effectively. And I would say that was pretty top of funnel. It's not a what is, it's not a definitional piece necessarily, but it's not for people who are actively looking for a solution like the one that I was selling with the piece of content. But I did weave in the product at the end, but because of the way it was presented, it was, shared by other thought leaders on LinkedIn because they were really like, it was presented with a lot of stats that were very relevant and very important for these people to learn. So it was an educational piece. It was really effective in that way. So I think that was a blurry, like bottom to the top of funnel, top mid funnel piece.
Okay. And so the idea here is we're presenting our company as like the helpful resource or like guide within like a topic space. Like if you want to learn more about this topic area, you can count on this company to have like an interesting perspective. So I guess what I'm saying is like this content should be used to build trust with potential buyers, to like showcase like the expertise of the company. Does that sound right?
I think that's definitely part of it. And I think in some, it does present it as a solution as well, and something that the reader could consider purchasing, but it doesn't make that the crux of the piece. It is more subtly incorporated into a larger story. But even if if the person reading it doesn't want to make that purchase, they'll still view the brand that's writing the piece as authoritative in the subject matter, as a resource for them, and something that they may then come back to or rely on in the future when they are ready for that type of solution.
Totally. And, it sounds like this type of content can often be repurposed to like many other places beyond just organic search. I know you mentioned LinkedIn, but like this type of content, it sounds like would also perform well in a newsletter or like another distribution channel that's not just organic search. And I know you work mostly with B2B companies, but could like a B2C company also create product-led content?
Absolutely. And obviously you can create very obvious content about your product, and that's a little bit different. But what I didn't mention in my intro is I did work briefly for a kind of like hybrid B2B, B2C company in the like draft beer equipment and bar equipment space. So they did have like an e-commerce site, and we did create content that I guess I would call product-led content, though I'm not sure I thought about it that way at the time. That talked about issues, that talked about interesting stories, that talked about, I don't know, how to make a particular cocktail or something like that. We didn't make the product necessarily the star of the show, but it was slightly woven in the story, but it wasn't about use this particular tool and use this particular ingredient that we sell to make this cocktail. It was more storytelling. It was more of an editorial approach.
And I know you mentioned earlier thinking like a journalist. And I've asked this question to like a few of our guests. What makes for a fantastic piece of content? Like what are the inputs, or like what are some of the potential ingredients that should be included into a piece of content like this?
I would actually say, and I'm glad you brought up journalism again, because I think that's kind of like at the foundation of my answers. But I think a lot of content falls short just in terms of like the writing quality itself. And I think the solution goes back to these journalistic principles. So in addition to finding a story that like someone cares about, there's some tenets of good long form writing that apply that probably seem obvious to people, but they're so commonly not followed that I think they bear repeating. So the first is be really thoughtful about your first sentence. You need a smart hook. So I don't know if you remember, Nate, but the first time we met a few months ago, you and I were talking about the heat map feature in Positional. And you said it helped you learn really quickly that readers do not like content that begins in this article.
I hate it.
I guess you must have seen people drop off very quickly at that point. So I wouldn't say that there's no place for language like in this article somewhere in a long piece of content to help with wayfinding, but you have to capture attention and interest first. And that's not easy because people are busy. We all know that as content marketers, that's obvious. A lot of block clubs, clients, audiences are reading the content we create when they're in work. So when they have 1,000 things running through their head. So hooks are important. And it's also tempting to fall back on like trite hooks, like the world of blank is changing at a rapid pace, or the blank industry is projected to reach, X billion dollars by 2028. And I assure you, I have probably used both of those lines at some point in my career, and both are better than in this article. But if we're talking about really fantastic content, I would avoid trite too, because that becomes white noise and people stop noticing it. I would also say, people bury the lead so much. After you hook your reader, you have to help them understand what the piece is about and the point you're going to make. And it should not take you 500 words to get there, because no one has that kind of patience or attention. You don't want to make the reader read between the lines or read your mind. So every sentence should be additive. It should be moving the narrative along, and the relationship between it and the sentence before it and after it need to be crystal clear. And then this one is another, it's not more than a pet peeve. I think it really adds to the quality of a piece of writing. And I don't know that people think about it too much, but I like to think of the key players in any piece of content as characters in a story. So in the case of B2B, those key players tend to be like the brand you're writing for, their customers and their customers' customers, plus various other supporting roles. So this can get to be like Game of Thrones level confusing, because in B2B, all of the players are business entities. And then the minute something becomes confusing, you'll lose your reader. So I see writers, what they want to do is change out the words they're using to refer to those players, because they have been trained to worry like word repetition is a problem. They need to break out their thesaurus, right? So say you're writing for a brand that targets banks, and they'll start calling it a bank, and then they'll change it to a financial institution, and then they'll say a financial service provider, and then they'll shorten that to provider. And then they'll kind of go back and forth between all these terms, and it becomes way more confusing than it needs to be. So what I like to tell writers that I'm working with is treat your players, even if they are generic businesses, like characters. If you were writing a novel, you would not call your main character, Jack in one paragraph and Carlos in the next paragraph and Michael in the next paragraph, because that's chaos, just because you didn't want to use the word jack too often. So you shouldn't do that when you're writing about business entities either. And so if you're writing about banks, call them banks the whole time and only banks, and that will help keep your reader on track.
So just to play it back so far, the hook is meant to like convince someone to keep reading, like to get them engaged. The lead tells the reader like what they need to know or what they want to know. So like we hook them into the lead. Does that sound right?
Yeah, you hook them into the lead. The lead confirms, yes, this is something that I want to read. This interests me. This will add value, or it's going to make a point that I want to know more about. It's kind of like your thesis statement too. If you're making an argument, it's almost like the tenets of good essay writing from grade school.
Yeah. Can all of that happen in the intro?
Yeah, and it depends on what you're calling an intro. So if you by intro mean literally the first paragraph, that's not quite what I mean.
I usually refer to intro as like the first 3 paragraphs.
Yeah. Then I would say for sure, definitely an intro.
Okay, so we've hooked them, we've got them the lead, and then we're using consistency in terms of how we talk about this business, the buyer. After we've gotten them the lead, then what comes next?
Well, that's where sometimes, and I think it depends on the length of the article, you may want to say to some variation of in this article, provide some wayfinding. It could be even anchor links to particular sections if people want to jump around. And that's just like kind of like the good scannability, digestibility, digital writing principles. So that may be warranted right after there. But then you're going to jump in, you're going to put in that heading, that H2 that says something else that's kind of attention grabbing, but not overly clever, so they have no idea what you're going to be talking about next. And then you follow those same principles of, at the top of the section, they should figure out pretty quickly like what the section's about and what it means. And every sentence needs to build onto each other and not waste anybody's time, because no one has that time to be that waste.
I might be getting a little distracted here, but I'm just curious. So does each like individual section of that piece then have like a new hook and new lead? So it's like hook, lead, hook, lead, hook, lead to like keep someone moving through that piece of content?
Yeah, to an extent. I would say that like you shouldn't be drastically changing hooks and leads so they feel like individual pieces, but every single section of a piece of writing should make a clear point and have a clear purpose, and that purpose should be evident to the person reading it. And it's a bit like you have to be a little artful about it. I don't recommend saying the thesis of this piece is, or the point of this article is. There are definitely more interesting ways to do it, but I think that can be lacking in writing sometimes.
And now just a quick word from one of our sponsors, actually our only sponsor. That is Positional.com. Positional has what I think is an awesome tool set for content marketers. We've got everything you need to take you from start to finish and help you scale this channel, as I've done over the last 11 years of my career. We'd love for you to check it out at Positional.com. How important are like visuals in all of this? Like are they important? Should we have graphics, videos, or is nicely formatted text just fine?
Nicely formatted text can be just fine, and but I think any piece is improved by some visual interest and some breaks in the density of the copy, especially if it's a really long piece. If it's a short piece, I think it's some sort of hero image is probably sufficient. And I think this is kind of just, again, the basics of good digital content, using tactics to break up the copy visually as well. So, making sure you're calling out certain pieces of text and using bullets and lists, all of those kind of like more obvious things of to promote like digestibility and scannability, so that it isn't, just these like giant breaks of text or paragraphs. And probably like breaking up paragraphs more than you might if you were, writing, a novel or something like that, just because digital is a different medium. So,
Yeah. And how do you go about like coming up with the topics? It sounds like it'd be a little bit more nuanced than just using like a keyword research tool. Like, how do you go about coming up with the topics we're going to write about?
It is more nuanced than that. I think we see largely at Block Club, we see SEO as a tool to improve the writing and the topics that we have assessed are important or interesting to tell to our audience based on research into our audience, based on a deep understanding of our clients' products and their industry and current events and issues that are happening within that space, and having regular conversations with their sales teams and with their marketing teams about what they're hearing from customers or what they're hearing from leads, or people who are in their sales pipeline, and using all of those to kind of craft ideas and come up with ideas that are generally pretty interesting. And then we can go back to the keyword research and we can see those search terms that we can, optimize those pieces for in a very natural way. And then we can do the work of like understanding, okay, maybe there's certain questions we have to answer in this piece to help rank for those keywords, but we don't necessarily, or I wouldn't say never, we definitely do sometimes, especially when we're at like the very top of the funnel, use keywords to inspire like what the actual piece of content is about. But most of the time, we're kind of going backwards and using it to just optimize as opposed to direct a piece of content.
I'm sure you've read like Google's helpful content guidelines, and they like explicitly say like, don't create like content for search engines, just create like really great content and search engines will find it. I mean, to a degree, yes, but it sounds like, yeah. So it sounds like you start with kind of these like core themes by talking to the sales team, by talking to the support team, by like understanding the business, and then like we see SEO as then like an additional distribution channel for that piece of content, and not necessarily like the only reason that we're creating this piece of content.
Yeah, very rarely, do we have a client who's interested in just using SEO. And the reason for that is that, we're working with clients who are in really novel product categories. Like they may be the first to be like developing this product. So there's not enough necessarily knowledge among their target audience about what they offer for people even to be searching, for even with any sort of commercial intent, or any sort of significant volume, the kinds of shopping for their products online, and on top of that, it's B2B, right? So they're selling to CEOs and other C-suite executives and product and finance. These people are not generally like Googling, how do I, what can I buy to build payroll tax compliance infrastructure into my products. Like that's just not happening. When it is happening, it's happening in lower volume. So we see it as one channel, as opposed to the driving force behind a lot of our clients' content strategies.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it sounds like with some of these clients you've mentioned, the sales process is a little bit more nuanced than someone just searching for best dog toys and is ready to buy like the best dog toy. I've been meaning to ask, how long is like the shelf life for this product led content? Like, is it like 6 months? Is it a year, or is it longer than that? Is it a lot shorter than that? Like, if we're creating this product led content, how long should it drive value for a business like this?
Definitely not short. I would say that at least even in its first version, probably has staying power for a year at least. And then, because they tend to be research driven, they tend to be kind of talking about current events. Not always, but a lot of the time. It's worth revisiting them after a certain amount of time and refreshing them and updating them. So we do tend to keep track of those pieces that we think need those, whether it's semi-annually or annually updates, and that allows us to extend the shelf life of the piece.
So you pretty regularly will come back to these pieces and update them if need be.
Yeah, and even aside from even kind of just bringing them more up to date and more timely, we worked with clients that products are changing regularly. Like they're early enough in their life cycle that they're always learning about product market fit and learning more from their customers about what matters to them. So even like their foundational brand messaging strategies are changing pretty regularly, especially in the early years of us working with them. So we'll often have to just go back to make sure that, this content that may still be performing well is also properly representing the brand as it is today, as opposed to where it was a year ago.
Do you have a favorite distribution channel like for this content?
It's B2B. So we're LinkedIn heavy. I think, well, a lot of our clients are selling to enterprise. They're selling to, C-suite or executive VPs of enterprise companies. So they know they can find those people on LinkedIn. So that's like the bread and butter. And I would say like maybe as, millennials and even Gen Z at some point kind of like venture more into these higher level positions. I think a lot of people are starting to play with the idea of using, quote unquote, younger social media channels like, TikTok and even Instagram and getting like B2B influencers on those channels. We don't have a lot of clients there yet, but it could be something that becomes a little bit more popular in the future. It's something to keep an eye on, but I don't think it's tried and true enough. And again, we're dealing with companies that, have finite budget. Who doesn't have a finite budget, but, they're not, Fortune 250 companies, so they can't just like spend endlessly and experiment endlessly. So we tend to stick with the channels that we know work.
How often can we be publishing product-led content? Can we do it every week if we wanted to?
We work at Block Club with a lot of clients on retainer. So it kind of depends on the size of that retainer and how much of like our time we dedicate to them. But yeah, I mean, we have clients that we're producing content for, and could be published on at least a regular basis at the frequency we're producing it, and then they can use their in-house team. Yeah, so I would say that absolutely it can be produced at least once a week.
Apologize for like not following the outline.
It's okay. I'm a very outline driven person who like prepares heavily. So some of these I'm like flying by the seat of my pants. But
yeah, no, I've been enjoying the conversation.
Yeah.
I'll try to pull us back to the outline. The last question I want to ask is, it sounds like who's ever creating this content needs to be like pretty intimately familiar with like the space that the company is in. And so as an agency, like, how do you become intimately familiar with that company's products and services? Is it just like a large amount of research even before you start writing that first piece of client content for the client?
I'd say that's very true. And that's why it's very hard to do well in this particular space. B2B tech and B2B fintech is where we spend a lot of our time and where our clients kind of live. That's the realm they play in. So the fact that we specialize in it and we have lots of clients and have had lots of clients in this realm gives us a bit of a leg up going into it, because there's a lot of like foundational principles that a lot of their technology shares. They're also often talking to a lot of the same personas, the same types of people in the business world. So we have kind of a more innate understanding of at least some baseline values, some things that are important to them, how their minds might work to a certain extent. And so that gives us an advantage going in. But we also spend time up front. We kick off every project with a pretty in-depth discovery period where we're talking to stakeholders and product and sales and marketing and in the C-suite. We're absorbing as much information about our clients as we can. A lot of times we're even given access to customers, if not right in the beginning, then eventually. And that helps us learn even more about their target audience and their ideal customer profile and what those really good fit customers look like and what's important to them. And we absorb a ton of their materials. We get product demos, so we immerse ourselves in it, and just because we do have this experience and background, it does make that part a little bit easier. And Yeah, and so it's not something that just like anybody kind of coming off the street, can necessarily do. But yeah, it does take work, and it really does require knowing our customers' products and their audience and their industry almost as well as they do.
Do you have a favorite client or one that you look back on and you say like, oh, I really enjoyed creating product-led content for this particular company?
The diplomatic answer is I've loved many, if not most, of my clients over the years. But two sort of stand out, and one is Argyle, who I briefly mentioned before. They're my longest client. They've been with us for 4 years now, and aside from that amount of time together, affording us the expertise we need to really like know their product inside and out. At this point, like, the VP of marketing there can give us a couple bullet points, and we can kind of run with something, and we can, I think, add a lot of value to a lot of their decisions and insights, and help them guide some of their marketing tactics. But aside from that, it also is just creates excellent camaraderie, and I feel like very devoted to their product and to their success. And that just makes the work more fun. I mean, we feel like part of their team, and I hope they feel the same way about us. And it just makes for a nice working relationship. And then I guess the only other one that comes to mind offhand is Plaid. And that's, they aren't currently a client. We worked with them for, say, like 2 years, back in like 2018 to 2020, right before they just like really just exploded and went huge, and grew this giant in-house team. And the reason that was really meaningful is that was my first B2B tech client. So that's really how I cut my teeth. And over the course of that relationship, I met so many great, interesting, smart people, and we had a great point of contact there who really offered me a lot of like advice and mentorship along the way. So I'll always be fond of my time with Plaid.
Well, this has been so much fun, and I've got a list of lightning round questions I'd like to ask you. I come up with these as we go, so these are not like pre-prepared. Are you ready? Are you ready for it?
I'm ready. I am ready. Do I get a pass if any of them feel like I have no answer for them?
Sure.
Okay.
That's totally
I don't know
fine.
like how challenging they are, but I'll do my best.
Well, it's a mix. We're gonna bounce around. The first one's on like ghostwriting. Like, if we're creating product-led content, should that content be like published under like the CEO of one of these companies, or should we actually use the author who wrote it?
At Block Club, no one who writes a piece of content actually gets a byline anywhere. We ghostwrite all of our content. And it should definitely be bylined by someone on their team, with expertise and authority. And that sometimes is the CEO, but sometimes, it's usually a mix of people from all over the organization who byline things.
Gotcha. What makes for a crappy client?
I won't say crappy, but I will say that what affects the quality of a relationship, and by that I also mean like what the client is able to, the value they're able to extract from us and get out of us, is not letting us in, right? So if you're an in-house marketer working with an agency, my recommendation is, especially if you kind of trust their strategic chops, which we try to pride ourselves on. We're not just a production house. We want to be strategic partners to our clients, is to bring them into the fold, right? Communicate what's going on inside the organization, communicate product, updates with everybody, bring them in and flies in the wall in meetings where they can hear kind of subject matter experts kind of talking about things that may be important, bring them into sales conversations so we can hear firsthand the details, the changes, the evolution of the product, the customer concerns that can help us make better strategic decisions for your content strategy and for individual content pieces.
How do we measure results? How do we know if it's working?
The question to end all questions, right? So B2B is particularly interesting in that, it's a really long sales process. So, and it's not a very linear one, right? So no one who, if I'm writing or creating a piece of content for a client that has an identity risk solution, no one's ever going to like click into that blog post, go to a storefront and make a purchase. They have to buy by committee. They have to bring this information, back to others within their organization. They could have months and months of sales conversations with someone at the brand to learn more about it. And so marketing and content marketing plays like a key role in nurturing those leads through email marketing and SEO and campaigns. But it's rarely the last touch point in a conversion. So that is definitely one of our biggest hurdles. Luckily, there's some technology that makes that challenge more manageable. So there's platforms like Winter, but we also use Positional in addition to like reporting tools like GA4. My team often leverages like your buyer journey feature to track user behavior, which has been really valuable in helping to identify content that drives positive business outcomes. So what we have to do is like use all of this this data to tell a story about the value of the content. And that's especially true if you don't have the really big budgets. Your clients don't have the big budgets to commit to these, more expensive attribution software.
I appreciate you plugging our product so much. I usually don't. So it's a nice change of pace for our listeners. You should you should check out positional.com. It's got a great set of tools that everyone needs. I've got two more. It wasn't the last question. I've got two more. Does it make sense to like put paid dollars behind some of this content on a platform like LinkedIn, or is that something your clients would do?
Oh, absolutely. I think especially if it's lead gen content, if it's a gated piece, we create those all the time. And lead gen is certainly the priority of our clients, especially at the stage they're in. That's more important to them than anything, because they need to prove, to their investors, to their boards, that like they have a pipeline and they have revenue coming in. So putting some money behind, especially content that's designed to engage, to generate leads. But even some of the product-led content, I think especially if it shows like good traction organically, I think that's a sign that putting some extra dollars behind it could get you even more traction out of it, more value out of it, and expose it to new audiences and build your awareness. So I would almost like test it on organic first, and then use that as an indicator of whether or not paid is warranted.
Totally. And my last question is, how can our listeners either connect with you or learn more about Block Club?
Our URL is blockclub.co. And so we have our portfolio there and our services, and that's a great way to learn about us and the whole team. There's bios. We're all senior led, so we're all senior level creatives and strategists, and we work remotely in 3 countries and have clients all over the world. So we aren't bound by geography by any means. And yeah, we really pride ourselves on becoming really tried and true extensions of teams. And offering strong and smart recommendations and being sounding board strategically for our clients. And I think we are able to identify root causes of their challenges that, they may not even see themselves because they're so close to it, not because they're not capable of it, because sometimes being so close to it kind of blinds you to certain things. So having third parties come in can be really helpful.
Well, we will put a link back to Block Club and to your LinkedIn in the show notes. So everyone can check for that there. But Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on this week's episode of the Optimized Podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
And that's a wrap. And I just want to thank our sponsor, Positional. They've got what is a pretty awesome tool set for content marketers and SEOs. They've even got a couple tools for social media. We'd love for you to check out Positional and the tool set that we've created over the last 15 months at positional.com. And you can always reach out to me if you have any questions. My email is nate@positional.com. Whether you've got questions about our tool set or comments and complaints, or even positive feedback about this podcast, I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button wherever you are listening to this podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.